Hello and welcome to My PGCE, a podcast documenting my journey as a trainee teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James B. Today I'm going to be talking to John Thornby about what makes a successful PGCE student. Now, I'll let John explain his credentials in just a moment, but I thought I'd just say how I know John. So if you've listened to the previous episodes, you'll know that I'm a resident tutor, which means I live with students in halls of residence as part of the university's welfare system. And resident tutors form the bottom tier of the hierarchy that's known as the residential life team. And up at the top are the wardens. So John is my warden. So in the residential life team, he's my boss, basically. And it just so happened that a large part of his career has been spent in teacher education. Now, this was my first attempt at an interview for the podcast. And John didn't have a headset, so his audio quality isn't great. But he's still perfectly understandable. And he's got lots of very interesting, very important things to say on the topic, so it's well worth sticking with it. Right, off we go.
Thanks for having me, James. As you said, my name's John Thornby, and I am formerly a university lecturer on a PGCE course. Full disclosure, I don't work for that university anymore. I've moved on, but up until Christmas, just gone, I was a lecturer on a PGCE program and have been since 2013, so about 7 years in the game. Prior to that, I've had a bit of a circuitous career, really. I've been all around the houses and done a variety of different things, but I had a research career in physics and maths and physical sciences generally. But in parallel with that, I was teaching maths at the time it was called the Further Maths Network. It later became the Further Maths Support Program and is now called the Advanced Maths Support Program. So that kind of gave me the bug for teaching, and I got more and more interested in it. I did a master's in maths education and then later a master's in educational innovation, and gradually kind of sidestepped from kind of doing maths to teaching maths and then teaching teachers of maths. So I've been involved in teacher education for, as I said, about 7 years. I'm still involved in teacher education now, but not in a PGCE course. And I guess my previous roles within teacher education, I've been one of the course leaders for secondary PGCE with particular emphasis on maths, but I haven't done a lot of the maths specifically for a couple of years. I've more been kind of leading the broader profile of courses on offer and focusing more on kind of school-based research and things like that. So got a fair amount of experience of teaching PGCE. I mostly focused on teaching the kind of academic side of the course rather than the teaching side of the course, but the two do go hand in hand, as I'm sure we'll explore shortly.
Okay, fantastic. And in your own words, what is the PGCE? How would you describe it?
So that's a very fair question, and I think it's something that a lot of people kind of get wrong or misunderstand, including former Education Secretary Nicky Morgan, who had the belief that, as many people do, that the PGCE is the defining qualification that allows you to teach, and that's absolutely not the case. It's a very common misconception. So the PGCE, it stands for Postgraduate Certificate of Education, as I'm sure most of your viewership is probably aware. But the crucial thing there is that it's an academic award given by an academic institution, typically a university, for some kind of academic performance. It's not really the thing that enables you to teach. That is the qualified teacher status that you get very much separately. But the two do go hand in hand. Now, obviously, I can only speak from the perspective of the institution that I worked at, where the two qualifications went hand in hand. You couldn't get the qualified teacher status without the academic award of usually the PGCE, but there is an award at honours level. So the postgraduate means it's at master's level, so it's the notch above, if you like, the level that most people will have been used to working at in their undergraduate courses. But there is an honours level qualification that you can sometimes get as an exit award if you don't quite hit the master's level criteria. But the crucial thing is, certainly at the institution I was at, if you didn't pass to some level the academic side of the course, you couldn't pass the actual teaching side of the course and wouldn't get your qualified teacher status. Similarly, there's typically no academic award on its own without the QTS. You get the two things hand in hand with each other, and they impact on one another as well. The idea really for most well-designed PGCs, certainly the ones that I've examined, the ones that I'm familiar with from other institutions that I've worked with, the academic side of the course informs what you teach and how you teach, and your teaching experience feeds into the writing of your assignments and the things that you study. A lot of PGC courses are really geared towards making you think about your discipline and your what's called pedagogy, so the ways and means that you teach. So you're really thinking about what you're doing in the classroom, what the popular things are within your field at the time, what the important issues are within your subject, and so on. So that really informs your thinking in the classroom. And typically, a lot of your assignments are quite reflective of your experiences. So you'll write about what you've done and justifying why you've done it, analysing how it was successful or not, and how you might change your practice going forward, or what you might modify as a result. So it's really it's part of the journey of becoming a teacher in kind of getting you to reflect and think about what you're doing, rather than just kind of blindly just trying stuff and not really having a systematic approach to analysing your own practice and things like that. So in some ways it gives you some structure to the way that you teach and the way that you progress. But some people can sometimes view the PGCE side of the course as a set of hoops to jump through that are a barrier there to make it kind of more difficult in some way. Not perhaps appreciating the value that the PGCE can add to your teaching and to your career development, and in giving you that structure and those mechanisms for reflection and access to and the knowledge how to analyse policy and practice, and how to identify appropriate sources of data and research that can impact on your practice and things like that. Some people really just want to go in and just get into the classroom and do it, and perhaps don't see the value in all of the other things that go around it. So I guess one of the key messages of PGCE courses is the value add that studying your discipline and being a scholar can add to becoming a better teacher in some ways. But that's not to say that everybody has to do a PGCE. There are multiple different routes into teaching. Some are, what's called school-centred, and where you are basically just in on practice, and the schools are entirely responsible for your training with no involvement from the university and without an academic award. And that's fine too. There is some value in just being immersed and getting on with it and being at the chalk face and so on. My personal view, though, is that teaching is a profession that needs to be research informed, and practitioners of teaching should have a skill set that enables them to find reliable sources of information, know how to evaluate things, and make good informed decisions. And I think that's something that's sometimes lacking from programs that don't have an academic component.
So I spoke a little bit about routes into teaching in an earlier episode of the podcast, and I came across the idea several times that the PGCE, though it isn't the only route into teaching, it seems to be the most universally recognised. I'll say universally, perhaps the most recognised across Britain. Would you say that's the case?
I think it's fair. I mean, certainly if you took a cross section of the population, not just within education, and said, do you know what a PGCE is? I think most people would have an awareness that it's something to do with teaching, and that's probably where this misconception comes from, that it is a teaching qualification. It's certainly very well regarded overseas. A lot of international countries like the British PGCE and the quality standard that it represents. But as you say, it's not the only route. It's a popular route for sure. I think the whole application, and I know you dealt with this in a previous episode, the whole application process is a bit of a minefield, I think. I think it's difficult for applicants to actually know really what they're applying to and what they're getting, because there are
Yeah.
so many different routes. There were certainly have been parallel application processes running for different routes, and depending on who you speak to, they'll push you down different avenues, because obviously universities are invested in getting bums on seats, and schools want to try and attract individuals that they hand selected for their own positions.
Mm.
So there are incentives there for both sides to try and get you to apply to the route that suits them the best. So, it's become quite a competitive marketplace, in a sense, for where the IT students are going to go. And I think that's made it a bit difficult, really, for potential teachers to know what routes are available and which one's best. And the websites are difficult to navigate and so on. I mean, not I know really what we're here to discuss today, but it is, I think, an important issue in the current context of teaching.
Yeah, it is important. So would you recommend perhaps the Get Into Teaching website and maybe the UCAS website also, to get like an impartial overview of the different routes into teaching, rather than consulting specific universities or schools? That's where I looked, and it seemed to give me a good idea anyway.
I mean, I would always say try and find as many sources as you can and apply some sort of discretion judgment process. Always think about it. It's kind of like the process that you go through when you're doing the PGCE. We want to give you a tool set that enables you to make good decisions based on evidence and based on your analysis of the situation. And this decision is no different, really.
Okay.
Talk to as many different people as you can. Look at different websites, and but think, don't just take everything at face value. Think about, why does the university want me to do their course? Why does the school want me to do their course? What's in it for them both?
Yeah.
How can I get a sense of what those products look like? And I use the word product there because it has become a bit of a consumer marketplace. What do I get differently from those two different programs? What will my experience be? Knowing the right kinds of questions to ask, getting a feel for what the program is going to look like, what experience it's going to be, how much time in each school, and so on. So answering the question, it's not something I think you can get very easily from the Get Into Teaching website, because although that can tell you about the different routes that exist, what those routes look like in practice is going to be very, very different from provider to provider.
Okay.
Even within the same school, you could be placed at that school as a school-based trainee at a skit, or what was formerly a teaching school, on perhaps a school direct placement, but they may also have placements from 1, 2, 3, maybe even half a dozen different universities that all get quite a different experience because of the way those universities structure their programs. So I think really you've got to kind of think about what route you might want to do, and then think about what the differences you're going to get are based on which university you go with, and so on. It's not an easy question to answer, really. And
okay.
We could go down a whole rabbit hole there.
So just to go a little bit further down the rabbit hole before we then pull out, one piece of advice I heard was to first think about where in the country you might like to work as a teacher, and then apply to a local PGCE program, because you'll likely get a school placement in that area. What do you think about that as advice?
That's a difficult one to sort of talk about, because I think a lot of people are in very, very different circumstances. I think if you are the sort of person who has the freedom and the resources to go anywhere and can be anywhere in the country, then absolutely that advice is right. Think about where you want to be and apply locally, or apply to a university, a series of universities all over the place, perhaps, that are at the reputational level that you're interested in.
Okay.
But the truth of it, and again, my perspective here is coming from having been the admissions tutor for a PGCE program for 5 years. A lot of people stay locally, and whether that's for in most cases, I would suggest that's probably for personal reasons. The ability to live at home and minimise your costs, and I don't know, have your washing done and a dinner cooked for you, possibly by mum, dad, guardian, whatever, or perhaps a little bit further on in life, maybe you're living with a partner and relocating isn't quite such an option. not everyone is in the position that they can just up sticks and leave. Some people like to stay where they were for their undergraduate because they know the area. They did a 3-year course and they've got friends who are on a 4-year course and still got a year to run.
Mm.
So they can still live with the same peer group and still be involved in the same kind of social activities. And it makes sense to be geographically in the same kind of place. There's a whole raft of personal reasons why you might choose certain institutions. So I think that really is a personal decision
Okay.
for people. But even if you are somewhat restricted geographically, there are in some cases, different areas, different options available to you. So you should still look into all the available options based on where you're living, even if you are staying at home or where you're currently based.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so now that we know who you are and what the PGCE is, let's talk about the PGCE students themselves. So my first main question is, what makes a bad PGCE student? And I don't mean an evil PGCE student. I mean a PGCE student who is perhaps more likely to struggle. And you could no doubt struggle in countless different ways, but I guess I'm looking for the typical ways in which a PGCE student may struggle and the reasons why. So what do you think?
Sure. Let's slightly reword the question, only slightly, because you said what makes a bad PGCE student, and I think that's slightly distinct from what makes an unsuccessful PGCE student.
Yeah, much better, yeah.
Because I think bad implies something wrong with the person or, it's an active decision that they're making, which could be the case.
Yeah.
But unsuccessful, I think, is slightly broader and includes, people who haven't been successful at PGCE for a variety of reasons, some well beyond their control. And I wouldn't necessarily say they were bad students.
Okay.
But that for various factors, they didn't manage to make it work for them. And I think that they are two distinct classes, really.
Yeah.
So I do want to make that distinction. I think the important thing to remember is that teaching is you'll probably hear this a lot. It's very much a vocational profession. Now, that's not to suggest that it isn't rigorous and disciplined. And I think that's sometimes where this whole debate of, is it an academic discipline or is it a vocation? I don't think they're necessarily separate in that sense. But it is vocational in the sense that you've really got to want to do it. And I think if you found yourself in it as the backup option, because the thing you really wanted to do didn't quite work out for you, but there's always teaching. I think people in that situation, if your heart's not in it, you're not going to be giving it 100%. You're not going to be putting your heart and soul into it. And that doesn't mean that you can't do it, because I've met plenty of fairly decent teachers who it really wasn't their first choice, but they've made it work and they do an okay job or even a very good job in some cases. So it's not to say that you can't do it, but I think it puts you kind of behind the curve if you are coming from that perspective of it wasn't really what I wanted to do. It's going to take some time to adjust into it and for perhaps it becomes the thing that you do want to do. Some people do fall in love with it when they get there. Other people don't. And I think some of the people that I've seen fall off courses in the past have been the ones that took a bit of a punt on it because they had a year that they didn't really know what they were doing with. So they just went for it, had a try, that sort of thing. And some of those people are the ones who it doesn't work out for. So having your heart in it, I think is important. I'm not going to say it's 100% necessary because, as I said, plenty of people I think have made very successful careers in teaching who weren't necessarily 100% invested in it at the start. But by and large, I think most of the teachers that I know, and certainly the ones that have stuck with it, are the ones that really, really love it, really care about their kids, really want to make an impression on people's lives and get into it for all these altruistic and intrinsic motivational reasons. And that's actually a focus of the research that I do. I'm very interested in people's motivations for teaching, why people get into it and what helps them to kind of remain engaged. So I'd say that's the first factor. I'd say a really important feature is a willingness and an openness to having, some difficult conversations sometimes, to receive feedback that maybe you don't want to be hearing, but what you need to hear, the ability to be able to take on board criticism of your practice and of the ways that you're teaching and so on, but take it on the chin and really think about it, take it away, reflect on it, and make positive changes to your practice as a result, rather than some of the unsuccessful teachers that I've seen who've either really struggled with the course or ended up quitting, who sometimes feel like they actually know better than their mentor. This person may have been teaching for 5 or 6 years. I know I only started last week, but I'm sure I'm right and that they don't know what they're talking about. And in a very, very tiny minority of cases, sometimes that is true. Sometimes mentors do call it wrong, but that's such a small percentage. I think you've got to have trust in the people that you're working with, that you're receiving feedback from, whether that be the mentor that you're working with in your school, whether that be whoever the person or persons from the university that you're working with might be. You've got to trust in the process, you've got to trust in their experience, and you've got to be willing to hear some of that feedback that might not always be to your liking. Everyone is going to crash and burn at some point on a PGCE course. Even the very, very, very best teachers have bad days and bad lessons. So to think that you as a PGCE student are going to be getting it right from day one is extremely naive. And I think people that come in with that impression and with that idea are very likely to come unstuck quite quickly. I think you've got to be willing to make mistakes. You've got to be willing to hear that you've made a mistake, and you've got to be willing to then take positive steps to try and minimise the risk of those mistakes happening again, or mitigate them, or see that those obstacles coming and avoid them, and so on. So really being able to take on board that. So when I think about the least successful people, it's the ones who there's always an excuse. Oh, the class work just didn't want to learn that day. Well, is it that the class didn't want to learn, or is it that something you did put them in that mood, or your behaviour or your lack of something or other in your practice put them in that zone, in that way of behaving, or you failed to control them at an earlier point, so it ran off the rails. So being willing to accept that you are in control, you are the responsible adult in that room, and a lot of the decisions that are made are down to you. Not to say that random things don't happen. Kids can be affected by all kinds of stuff. Like on a windy day, kids' behaviour is really weird. And
really?
Probably, yeah. It's just bizarre sometimes. You can't control the weather as a teacher.
Has that been a matter of research?
I don't know, to be honest with you, but it seems to be an opinion that people hold. If you ask a teacher about how kids can behave on a windy day, they're weird.
That's weird. I mean, my partner's mother's dog also behaves weird on windy days, so maybe it's a more general thing.
There we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
So some things are beyond your control, but by and large, there are a lot of things that you can do in the classroom to make a big difference. And if you stand there and say, well, it wasn't me, it was the kid's fault, or I think you're kind of trying to get rid of the responsibility and pass the buck a little bit. So you've got to be willing to take responsibility. You've got to be willing to have a difficult conversation and hear some feedback that maybe you won't like. The relationship between the trainee and the mentor is really, really important, I would say. Probably the most important relationship that you'll have on the course, because that mentor is someone you're going to be working with day in, day out. You'll most likely be covering a lot of their classes. You'll be having usually one-to-one meetings with them fairly regularly, probably weekly, if not even more frequently than that, but they might not be quite so structured or formal on other occasions. Typically, you have, certainly from the experience of the courses I've run, one weekly sort of formal sit-down meeting where you'll discuss things, but you'll almost certainly run into each other in the coffee room and whatever, or grab a quick 5 minutes of break time between lessons just to quickly debrief about something that you might want to action there and then.
And so can I just clarify, is this your mentor, your PGCE mentor, or is this a mentor that you're likely to have in your school? Because you get both, don't you?
Yeah, so I should be clear about the nomenclature, sure. So in the context that I worked at the university I was at, the mentor was the school-based person.
Okay.
So that they would be, you typically have two mentors. You have a subject mentor for secondary, of course. I think you may have some primary viewers, but for secondary, you'll have a subject mentor who is a subject specialist who's within your department, who you work really closely with kind of day to day.
Yeah.
And they're responsible really for your development as a professional within your subject. So they'll discuss kind of pedagogy with you and what the specific people's needs might be and anything that's kind of subject related. And then you'll have a professional mentor who's kind of more responsible for your broader development as a professional, who will look at kind of, school level stuff, behaviour policies, things like that, the things that aren't really kind of restricted to the classes that you're teaching and the subject that you're teaching. That's fairly commonplace. It's not universal. It's not necessarily the same everywhere on every course, but it's fairly universal that you'll have at least one, probably two people within your school that have some sort of responsibility towards your training. If you're on a PGCE course at a university, you will additionally have usually the nomenclature can be very different. Some people still use the word mentor and that gets confusing. Some people will use the word tutor. Some universities have their own language like teaching fellow or something like that. But a university member of staff who is responsible for you, who you will see at the university when you go in, and they'll do kind of catch-up meetings with you. They may very well come and visit you on your placement and perhaps observe a lesson with you. The regularity of that will differ from university to university, but typically I would say probably termly. Once a term, that person will probably come in and watch you teach and have a discussion with you and your mentor about how your progress is going and so on. It can get confusing because sometimes those terms can be used interchangeably and different institutions will use different names for the same kind of thing, so it can be confusing.
But it's your relationship with your teaching mentor in your school which is especially important for your success.
Yeah. Exactly, because they're the person you're going to see day in, day out. They're going to be setting your timetable. They're going to be in most of the classes with you. They're going to be talking to you about how you teach and how you develop and so on. You won't just see their classes, probably. Obviously it depends on the size of the school and the size of the department and particular subject that you teach and so on. But by and large, they'll be in a lot of your classes. They'll see you, they'll see you probably most days, and they'll be your first go-to if you've kind of got any questions or anything. So having a good relationship with them is very important. And I think some people can, rub their mentor up the wrong way, or vice versa. I'm not going to try and pretend that all mentors are absolutely perfect. We're all human, and there are relationship breakdowns and there are personality clashes and so on. But that is a very, very important relationship, and the more successful you're going to be as a trainee, I think, kind of boils down to how well that relationship goes. And I think where people have had a real fallout with their mentor and really disagree with them and don't get on with them and disagree with their feedback and so on can be difficult. And we've seen trainees in the past go through 3, 4, 5 mentors, have several different placements, have all said the same thing, but in the trainees' eyes, the schools have got it wrong. The mentors don't know what they're talking about. I'm right, and they're the ones who really don't work. Do you know what I mean? So really, having that openness to receiving feedback and knowing that it's not always going to be rosy and sunshine. Sometimes it's going to be not great, and that's absolutely be expected. There's no judgment on it. There's no, it would be really naive to think that everybody's going to be brilliant at teaching it on day one, and that's really not the case. And you get some people who are very, very successful at things that they've done previously coming into teaching, and it's a different discipline that requires a different skill set, and and it can take time, but the vast majority of people can and will get there if they work hard at it, and if they put the effort in, and if they manage those relationships. It is a very relationship based profession. You've got to have a relationship with the children. You've got to have a relationship with the colleagues in your department. Teaching isn't a solo profession, really. There's a lot of teamwork involved. There's a lot of dynamics to a department, and different roles to perform and things like that, and different sources of support and help and so on. So I think it's important to remember you're not in it on your own.
Yeah.
You will have various people to go to and turn to, talk to you for advice, and so on. So don't approach it as a kind of solo sport, if you like.
No.
It's very much a
team sport.
game.
Okay, fantastic. So just to recap, things that tend to make for an unsuccessful PGCE, they include not having sufficient motivation, not being open-minded or self-reflective enough, or lacking the ability to take feedback on board, and also perhaps not having good relationships, especially with your teaching mentor who you'll meet in your school.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would add to that a few other things I would say as well. Um, Certainly at the secondary level, subject knowledge is very important. You know how well you know your subject, um, and it's probably worth being aware that legislation in the UK now doesn't require a teacher to have a degree in their subject necessarily. It certainly used to be the case that they would have to have it was the so-called 50% rule. Your degree had to be 50% in the subject that you're teaching. That was relaxed many years ago. Um, the requirement now is just that teachers have a degree of some sort, and from there on, it's kind of up to the provider of their teacher education as to what qualifications they'll accept. And so, in a lot of subjects, there are things called subject knowledge enhancement courses, which are available to bring you up to speed really with the subject that you're going to be teaching. And I think they're to be encouraged. I think we do need to broaden the pool of people that we can select from as teachers to get people that are very, likely to be socially very good at teaching, who perhaps don't have the academic background of the course, the subject that they want to teach. So I think they're all great ideas, but subject knowledge is important. And I think where some trainees struggle is where they're teaching something where they feel like they're out of their depth. They lack confidence in the subject. They don't know it as inside out as they perhaps should. Um, I've certainly known trainees in the past who, even with the degree in the subject that they're teaching, are still learning things on YouTube the night before they're teaching it. And you're really up against it in a teacher training course. Now, not to put anybody off at all. It's a hard profession, and you're learning it in very difficult circumstances. Certainly, in the last 18 months of COVID, in an awful situation for trainees. But it's just an extra barrier if you've got to really learn the thing first before you can actually get into the classroom and teach it. And I think that can be difficult for some people because, the school day is a full working day in and of itself. Then you get home and you're going to have some assessments to do, you're going to have planning to do, and that planning process can be very, very time consuming at the start of your career. It gets quicker. So let me reassure everybody that's listening who might be at the beginning of their journey at the moment and thinking, how on earth does anyone teach if planning just takes so long? It does get quicker. I can absolutely promise you. You'll get kind of patterns, and you'll have a feel for how lessons flow and certain things that it's like driving. When you first learn to drive, you've got to be really aware of everything you do. You've got to be aware of how hard you're pressing the clutch and where each gear is, and you're looking at absolutely everything, and you're making sure that you're looking in your mirrors and all of those different things. And teaching can sometimes be like that, but as you get more experience, you become less kind of actively aware of all the things that are going on and doing something kind of almost on autopilot, like some experienced drivers. We describe it as a state of unconscious competence where you're doing all the right things, but you're not even aware that you're doing them because it's just become kind of second nature. And a lot of teaching can become like that because certain things that at the start you'll put in your plan, I need to be aware of this, I need to watch for that, and I need to, I've got to keep my eye on this particular person for this reason, and this is what I'm going to do about it. All of those things no longer end up in your plan after a little while because you just know those children, you know what you're expecting, you know a lot of timings, you'll have a kind of set routine or a couple of routines that you can kind of fall back on where you don't have to plan the timings quite so much because all of that thing becomes second nature. No, I digress. Planning gets easier. But I was talking about more generally how how the time of your day kind of pans out. At the beginning, certainly where you're spending a lot of time on planning, what you don't want to be doing is needing to spend another 2 hours watching YouTube, reading books, really trying to understand the topic inside out because you don't quite get it yet. So I think something that you can do if any of your viewers are, thinking about applying for teaching in next year or in future years, I would invest now in, really trying to put some of the groundwork in with your subject because that will save you time and certainly gain you some sleep later in the future to really be 100% confident with your subject. And there's also nothing worse than being in a classroom and getting asked a question and you really don't know the answer because you're only 2 pages ahead of them in the textbook. And that does happen sometimes, it can particularly happen to science teachers where you might be a specialist in one of the 3 disciplines, but perhaps not be quite so confident in the other 2. So you might be absolute whiz at physics, but actually you don't really know what you're doing with the biology, but you're going to be expected to teach it. So putting in some of the groundwork on that before you get there. So I would absolutely encourage people to do a subject knowledge enhancement course if it is applicable in your subject and if you're eligible for one. Because I think that, some people see it as a barrier or an extra thing that they've got to do, a hurdle to jump that's going to make it more difficult to get onto the course. And that's really not the case. It's there as a support tool to make sure that you are in the right position to be able to teach effectively. You can't possibly hone your craft of teaching if you don't know the thing that you're teaching. It's just common sense, right? And although practically the rules allow the subject knowledge enhancement courses to be done in parallel with the teacher training, I would not advise it. A lot of people will accept you for courses under those circumstances, mostly because they want a teacher here and now, or they want bums on seats here and now because it boosts their numbers for their courses or whatever. But I guarantee you will have a worse time on the course as a result because you're trying to do too many things at once. It's a full-time job plus just on its own. Then if you're doing a PGCE, you've also got academic assignments that are going to eat some of your time. If you're doing, if you're also trying to do a subject knowledge enhancement course on top of that, it's just too much. And I think one of the big pieces of advice I would give people for teaching is to be realistic about how much free time you're going to have and what things you can take on. Because, as I said, it is a full-time job. It's difficult at the best of times, in the best circumstances. And most people won't be in the best circumstances. That's just the nature of education. Most schools won't have necessarily the resources because schools are so underfunded. You might very well have some quite significant travel times to factor into your day where it's going to be difficult to do anything productive, if you're concentrating on driving.
Unless you're on autopilot.
Unless you're on autopilot. Yeah, you do all your lesson planning in the car. I do not recommend that.
No, don't do that.
No, but you know what I mean. There are other things that come out of your day, so you've got to be realistic. If you've got children, be realistic about how much time they are going to take, and whether you need to have childcare in place, whether you've got other friends, family members, relatives that can take some of the time to create the time that you're going to need. I feel that teaching should be inclusive, and certainly most PGCE courses will be inclusive and try to make accommodations for people with caring commitments and families and so on. But the reality is it can be very, very difficult, particularly if you've got young children and if they're going to be ill at times, and that's going to mean that you can't be in school and so on. And that's not to put people off. I've known some very, very successful teachers who've got 4 kids and juggling, spinning all kinds of different plates. But I've also known some very unsuccessful teachers who have basically nothing going on in their lives whatsoever and have all the time in the world, and somehow still don't find the time to do it all. So I think being organised and being proactive and managing your time well and effectively is super important. And only really how well you can do that and what other things you've got going on. So I'd certainly use the first couple of weeks or months of your PGCE course to just really think about how much time you've realistically got, because it probably will, it will ramp up in intensity. You might think, first couple of weeks easy, it's great, I love teaching, this is going to be a doddle. But actually you'll end up taking on more and more classes, which therefore creates proportionally more assessment, which creates proportionally more planning and so on. And so by the end of the autumn term, as we close in on Christmas, you'll start really sort of seeing the work piling up, and maybe then have to think about how many social commitments it's realistic to take on and so on. That's not to say that you can't have a social life. That's not the case at all. But you do need to just be realistic. I think it would be very naive to think that you aren't going to have to make some changes or sacrifices to become a successful teacher, because I think you will. Certainly at the start, when you're in that phase where planning does take up a lot of your time, and perhaps if you are having to teach things to yourself first, that is going to take up some of your time, and you're going to have to make some sacrifices. Perhaps you might have to give up a hobby or two as a result. But I think it's also important that you do factor in time for yourself. Don't think this is now me, this is now my identity. 100%, I have to be a teacher. There is a certain sense in which you are a teacher at all times. Certainly professionally, you have to be, you have to maintain that professionalism of being a teacher. But that doesn't mean that you can't be you. You've got to have something that's kind of your release, that's your you time, right? And finding that balance is the important thing. You don't want to go into work and be told that you're not trying hard enough and that you haven't put the hours in and that your plan's not detailed enough and so on. So don't go too far down the partying all the time and doing all the sports and everything in line. But if you go the other way and you're only focusing on teaching and you put so much effort into it that you burn out and you feel like you don't have a release valve or escape mechanism or anything like that, that you can go too far the other way. So you've got to finally balance those things and find that middle ground where you're giving the teaching the time and space that it deserves and that it needs, but without letting it overcome you.
Yeah.
In some senses, it can be like a gas in that it will fill the available space that you give it. And if you are prepared to stay up stupidly late every single night and to get your planning done, then you'll do that and it'll burn you out and you'll feel worse as a result. But your plans won't be that much better than if you just did them, gave yourself less time on them and forced yourself to work with those constraints. And I think that's where really successful people operate, is they give themselves constraints and work to them. And occasionally you might misjudge something and it does genuinely take more time and you overrun, but broadly.
But that's part of the learning process, I guess.
Yeah, it is, yeah. And I think perfectionism can sometimes be the enemy.
Yeah, very
some
much
people
so.
try so hard to get something perfectly right that they spend so much time on it, and it's diminishing returns. There is an adage that 20% of the effort gets 80% of the result. And I don't know quite how far I would agree with the exact numbers there, but I think there's something to it in that you can get something approaching a workable plan for a lesson quite, fairly quickly. And then once you do all the little tweaks and the changes here and there, each one of those is adding proportionally less value.
Yeah.
And by the time you factor in that 2 minutes into a lesson, it might all go off the rails because they didn't know a thing that you thought that they were going to know, or someone kicks off and you lose 10 minutes still dealing with an issue that you haven't foreseen or something like that, then you're not on the plan anyway, right? And all of those hours that you put into that plan to, for all these tiny little tweaks and things, they become worthless because you never actually teach that lesson anyway.
Yeah. And I'd guess that when you're dealing with a class of 30 variables or unknowns, like perfectionism is just a futile mission completely.
Absolutely, yeah. I know people, I know perfectionism is a recognized thing, and it's not easy to just say, don't be such a perfectionist, I'm being quite naive there, suggesting that that's
I think it's rooted in anxiety, to be honest.
It is, yeah. And, so it's a little bit blasé of me to just say, don't be a perfectionist. And that's perhaps unfair to people that actually do struggle with that. But it is something to be aware of. There's a phrase, good enough is good enough.
Yeah. And I guess doing something like the PGCE, you could see as an opportunity to help overcome an issue like perfectionism.
I think so. Yeah, for sure. It can be difficult to get your head around, and certainly in the early days, I think, and this is my opinion, I think a lot of universities they kind of want too much from the planning, and it becomes almost I'm not going to say a worthless activity, because it's never a worthless activity, but I think some of the things that go into a plan in the early days, I don't necessarily think add the value that people will sometimes say that they do. So I'm not saying people shouldn't plan. That's not the case. I think there's a lot of things that go into a plan that I think a more experienced teacher won't be putting in plans.
Yeah.
And you might hear some teachers say that they don't plan, but that's much further down the line when they get more kind of confident and once they know their schemes work inside out and things like that. And people will get to that point.
Yeah, when you've got that unconscious competence, that highest level of expertise. but
Yeah,
it takes much longer, clearly.
it does. Yeah, but certainly if the course that you're on has a very involved planning process, then applying a perfectionist approach to that is going to, um, really damage you in the long term. I think you're just going to put a lot of hours into something that, in my opinion, doesn't add a huge amount of value.
Yeah.
And again, that is my opinion. Certain aspects of planning are absolutely crucial. I think some of them add limited kind of usefulness. I would try and seek efficiencies where you can. Having a template that where you can copy and paste certain things. If your plan requires you to have a list of all the children in the class and what special allowances are made for them based on their needs or whatever, don't write that out every single time if you can copy and paste it. That was certainly advice I would have given a few years ago. Now I think it's sometimes harder to have that because when GDPR legislation came in, a lot of schools, well, a lot of institutions more generally, became very, very risk averse in terms of personal data. And so just having lists of students' names and their disabilities and, what special educational needs they might have suddenly became a big deal. And rightfully so. But so just having those available as a list was challenging. But I think if you can have that, and if you can store that in a secure way, I think you can save yourself a lot of time by being able to copy and paste things and whatnot, and exploit efficiencies that way. Because just typing out 30 people's names that's the same as it was yesterday and the day before is a complete waste of time, isn't it?
Yeah.
So do what you can to be efficient. I wouldn't plan too far in advance because, as I said, plans can go off the rails quite quickly. And if you plan 5, 6 lessons ahead, or even a whole term ahead, as one of my trainees did once, it's great if you manage to find the time to do that. But at the same time, if just one of those lessons in the run up to that whole term plan goes off the rails, all the rest of your plans are out, and then you've got
the house of cards. Yeah.
So you've got to be thinking ahead and looking ahead and being aware of what's on the horizon. But I think actually planning more than a couple of lessons ahead is a little bit silly, really, because you just don't know what's going to happen between now and then that's going to change what goes into that plan. Because really, every lesson's got to depend on the lesson before it. And, at what point did they get to at the end? Who understood what? Where were they in their learning? And in their understanding, and that's going to completely change how you approach the next lesson, what activities you give them. Do you have to recap something? Can you move on more quickly? So there's a lot of variables, as you said, and it's so difficult to kind of factor all of those in. Again, it's one of those things that you'll get more of an intuition for the longer you've done it for. So that will get quicker year on year. But certainly at the start, I think knowing where to put the effort, I think, is important.
Okay, fantastic. So, we've covered a lot of ground there, but I reckon there's at least 6 clearly discernible categories into which these factors fall. So concerning motivation, open-mindedness, relationships, subject knowledge, planning and time organization, but then also not going too far down that road and burning out and trying to do too much planning and organization. So, okay, so anything else you'd like to add?
I could probably talk all day. But it was limited on time. So, it's a difficult one. Everybody's different. Everybody's got their own circumstances that they're working within. Different living arrangements, different, backgrounds, different family circumstances. Everyone's going to have a different journey time. The only thing that's really consistent for everybody is that there are 24 hours in everybody's day, and how you spend those hours is what's going to really make or break how successful you are. And some people will take to teaching like a duck to water. Others of them will have to work much harder at it. There's no kind of guarantees in teaching at all. So there aren't any kind of hard and fast rules or anything like that. All I can say is try and be as efficient with your time as you can. I've heard people say, "Oh, it's so hard to plan," but they're doing it in front of the TV and also half watching the telly, and you can't do that. You've got to block off some time and say, "This is work time. I'm doing work, and this is my relaxation time." and relaxing, and don't let them overlap, because if you do, you won't be doing either of them even 50% effectively. You won't really get anything out of the TV programs that you're watching, and you won't have done your planning properly, and you'll feel like you've spent your whole evening and not got anywhere.
Yeah, I've heard a good strategy for helping with that is to have separate places for your working and your resting. So only do your work, say, at university or in the classroom, and then when you're at home, try to rest. I mean, that might not be practical for everyone, but or at least maybe so. Say if you're going to have to do some work at home, then do your work in one room and rest in another, for instance. That could help.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly reasonable. I've heard certainly similar things about when you're in bed. Bed is just for sleeping. If you suddenly start relaxing when you're in bed and watching TV and stuff like that, then your brain kind of starts muddling what mode you're supposed to be in, and it can really mess your body clock up.
Let alone if you start trying to do lesson planning like in bed, that could be very confusing for
Absolutely, yeah.
For your sleep routine.
I certainly think there's some truth to that, yeah. But as you say, it's not practical for everyone, because you might be coming home to a house with a screaming children,
yeah,
or a massive laundry pile that needs doing, or you've got 5 or 6 housemates that are also students at doing other courses that are in a perhaps different space, different mentality to you. So everybody's personal circumstances are different. So how you use your time becomes really important, and I think where you can, try and help yourself as much as you can before you start your teacher training. Try and position yourself as well as you can before you start it. So if you can, do some volunteering and get a good sense of what schools are like before you end up in one. Again, that used to be part of the application process. It used to be the case that you had to have done, I think it was something like at least 10 days in the school to get a sense of what schools are really like. That was removed a few years ago. The government issued a very strong warning that we could no longer, I say we, I'm not part of the university anymore, but the university sector generally, with the teacher training, teacher education sector more generally, couldn't discriminate on people that haven't had any time in schools. So we just had to let people in who didn't have a clue what schools were like. And lo and behold, they turn up on day one, go to their school, realise that they actually didn't like schools at all and didn't like children. And therefore they weren't successful. So I think, looking bigger picture, do what you can beforehand. So get some experience in schools. That might be hard at the moment, because certainly under COVID, schools are very wary about having visitors and people in schools. But I'm hopeful that will open up at some point this year, and schools will be more amenable to having visitors and volunteers and so on. So get a sense of whether schools are right for you, and look at more than one as well. It's very, very easy, and that's what I think one of the downsides of the school direct model or a skip model of teacher education is you only really get that one perspective on teaching in the school that you're predominantly based, and it's very easy to feel like, well, that's just what teaching is, but actually the experience of teaching can be so different in a lot of different places. So don't judge your experience in one school. Try and get into 2, 3 schools. Have a think about how they're different, in what ways are they similar, but what were the dynamics? How are they different? Try to go for different schools that are in different kind of socioeconomic regions. One in a bit more of a deprived area might be a more challenging school. Perhaps one more in a more affluent area, and get a feel for how they're different, because every school is just unique. Every set of circumstances creates a different picture. So don't make any decisions based on just one perspective. And again, that's something that I tried to bring into my teaching when I was teaching on the PGCE. It's a process called triangulation. When you're looking at something, you don't just want to look at it from one single perspective and make a decision based on that. You want to look at it from a multiple different angles, to try and really get a sense of what it looks like, because one perspective can be quite deceptive. So try and get multiple perspectives. Talk to people who are in the profession. Some teachers will try and sell it to you. Others will say, biggest regret I've ever had. Now I can't get out of it. And everything in between. The majority of teachers absolutely love it, and that's why they stuck with it. But you will hear a lot of the downsides as well, and that's what comes out in the public quite often.
Yet it's good to hear both sides. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I've tried to factor into the application process at the university that I worked at, especially once the requirement was removed for having to actually spend any time in the school.
Mm.
You know, we very much try to give both sides of teaching in an article that we ask trainees to read and have a conversation about, which paints some of the pros and cons, because we want people to come from an informed position where they have at least considered what the the pluses and minuses are, the pros and the cons, and so that we can be confident that they've at least gone through that thought process and given it due consideration, and that they're not just going to turn up on day one and realise actually this isn't for me. It's a valid opinion to have, but we would also prefer that we didn't waste each other's time with those kinds of people. So you can help yourself, I think, by getting some of that experience ahead of time. So spend some time in school if you can. Spend some time brushing up on your subject, ideally doing a subject knowledge enhancement course in the preceding year rather than in parallel, because you want as few distractions as you can really from the teaching. It's hard enough even under ideal circumstances, as I said. So the fewer distractions that you've got, I think, the better.
Okay, fantastic. So I'd originally planned to ask what makes for an unsuccessful candidate or an unsuccessful PGCE student, and then for a successful one separately. But I think we covered pretty much all the ground in the first question, unless you think there are any special traits of a successful trainee that kind of go beyond just the inverse of where people go wrong.
I think there are, if I'm honest, but I don't think they're things that you can go away and work on. I think people just have particular kinds of personalities that take to teaching, and that's not something that you can practice or go away and work on, or at least not to such a huge extent. Like the ones who really fly and just get it, I think that's a kind of natural quality, and not something that I can say, well, go and work on being a natural teacher in the year before you do it, because that's just not realistic, is it? And I think a lot of it boils down to personality characteristics. So a lot of my research is based on kind of psychometric evaluations and what types of people get into teaching. And there's a model called Holland's model of vocational interest, which kind of breaks the whole kind of job market, if you like, down into 6 different characteristics. And teaching is on one kind of side of that model. And I think if you're the sort of person that likes social and creative endeavours, you will inherently be drawn more to teaching than someone who is kind of more rooted in realistic and investigative type endeavours. And that's where there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect between STEM teachers and teaching in general, in that people who are more attracted to STEM disciplines, and by STEM I mean science, technology, engineering, mathematics, within this model that's quite popular in kind of career theory, if you're the sort of person who's interested in STEM, you kind of live on one side of it. It's on a hexagon, the model. It's kind of on a hexagonal plane kind of thing. You live in one kind of corner of that if you're the kind of person who's interested in the sciences and mathematics. Whereas teaching kind of lives on the opposite diagonal corner.
That's very interesting. So is that why there's a shortage of maths teachers, perhaps?
I think that contributes to it. I mean, I think there's a lot of factors, if I'm honest with you. I think, the job market is calling out for people with good science and mathematics degrees, and those jobs can be quite lucrative, and that can be quite attractive in comparison with teaching. So I think a lot of people who are good at those subjects get lured away for higher paychecks elsewhere. But this is also why I think that the subject knowledge enhancement course is a good idea, because it means that people who are more interested in teaching but not necessarily quite so adept at the actual discipline itself can learn the discipline that they perhaps didn't want to study at university because they wanted to do something more creative. And that's not to say that sciences and maths aren't creative, because they can be creative. I think it's a really big misconception that they're not. But generally speaking, certainly within this model, they tend to live in the investigative and reality domains rather than the kind of social and communicative domains. So people who have one preference, the people who prefer science type disciplines tend not to be the kinds of people who would like teaching, and the kinds of people who would like teaching tend not to have also got an interest in science and math. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, and within the model, people search for kind of a congruence between what they're interested in and the characteristics of the jobs that they're going for. So people with that investigative, realistic background go into science and sciencey disciplines and not so interested in teaching. And the people that are super interested in teaching tend to be from more creative and artsy type backgrounds. And again, that's a huge generalization. It doesn't apply to everyone, but it is a generalization that fits this model. And that's where the models kind of come from, not just from sciences and teaching, but like looking at all kinds of career profiles. So that's something I've used quite a bit in my research, and something that's kind of feeding into the research I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah, so that's certainly an interesting, like, explanatory or even predictive model, I guess. But like you said, it's not it's typically something that's outside the trainee's control to change.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely. I mean, I don't know to what extent those characteristics, if you like, are fixed, and to what extent that they can be controlled and shaped over the years by our experience, and to what extent they're just genetic and inbuilt. So to sort of return to your question, what can a trainee do that would really single them out? I don't think you can. I think, there are certain kinds of people who will just get it, and there are other people that will have to work much harder at it, but they can and will all get there in the end.
Yeah.
But they'll take very, very different paths and different amounts of time to get there. And it's not something that I think you can easily teach or just practice. I think the things that you can do are to put yourself in the best position before you get there, and to apply that open-minded mindset of being prepared to accept feedback and not be so closed.
Yeah. Okay. So though there are certain inherent characteristics that may predispose you to doing better or worse as a trainee teacher, I mean, there's still certainly lots of things you can work on that may ultimately determine how well you do or how well you don't do.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I guess if you only want to worry about the things you can control, which is all you should worry about, then those are the things you should focus on.
Yeah, and I think just to reassure people, because I know I've said a lot of things there, and you might listen to some of the things I said and go, oh, well, that's not me. Well, I don't think, as I said, I think everyone can and will get there if they put the work in. I can certainly remember a maths trainee, a number of years ago now. And to be honest, when I met him, I thought, this guy's not a teacher. Absolutely not. He doesn't have any of the characteristics that I would have expected of a teacher. And he soldiered on, and he worked really hard and ended up doing pretty successfully, not outstandingly, but pretty successfully throughout his year. He was a maths trainee. And if I had to describe him, I would describe him as a teaching robot.
Okay.
He would basically do whatever you told him to do. So you said that wasn't very good, do it this way. He would do it that way the next time. Absolutely, exactly like you told him to. And in some senses, that's not what I would expect from a teacher, because I would expect the teacher to be kind of more creative and more, well, they said do it that way, but I'm going to put my little twist on it like this, because that's what, in my mind, teachers are. He was very much what they've said, do it that way, so I'm going to do it that way. And he did. And in that way, it kind of actually really endeared him to his mentors, because although he was kind of robotic, and I would suggest, actually, if I'm being completely honest, probably somewhere on the autistic spectrum, I would imagine. And I know some very, very successful teachers who are autistic as well, so that's not an impediment or a barrier at all. But he had that openness of listening to feedback. Now, although it manifested in a very, very different way for him, but it was very much, I'm going to take everything I hear on the chin. It doesn't affect me one way or another. If I'm told that something hasn't gone successfully, I'm going to just take that on board, and then they said do it this way, so I'm going to do it this way. And each iteration, he got better and better, and at the end was a very decent teacher, and I believe is still in teaching.
That's amazing.
But from day one, I would have said, this kid isn't going to last a week. He was very, very young and fresh-faced. You could have easily imagined that, well, I think he was straight out of uni, but I could have easily imagined that he was just a sixth form student, like not even a graduate at that point. He looked very young. I thought, the children are going to eat him alive. But no, he rose to the occasion, and as he went along, he just grew and grew. And all credit to him. So absolutely anyone can get there, but you've got to want to do it, And I think if you're just doing it on there's quite a decent bursary for maths, and I haven't really got another plan for this year, so we'll just do a few weeks and see how it goes. I think you're kind of already booking yourself for a bad experience. I think you've got to go into it open-minded. This is going to be a difficult and challenging year, but it's going to be a fun year. I'm going to meet some new people. I'm going to meet loads of people on my course. I'm going to meet a whole school full of staff who, I'm going to be friends with outside of work. I'm going to work with all these diverse children. There are going to be rough times for sure, but there are going to be some great moments as well. The penny drop moments that people talk about, and when you see that you've had a real tangible impact on a student's life, I think is a real shining moment. So you've just got to be open-minded about it and be prepared to take on board some criticism along the way. But everybody can get there if they're prepared to do that.
So that was my conversation with John Thornby about what makes a successful PGCE student. And we covered lots of ground, but I'd say the main things were motivation, willingness to learn, taking responsibility and control, relationships, especially the trainee-mentor relationship, perseverance, subject knowledge, planning, time management, the work-life balance, discipline, resisting perfectionism, efficiency, prior experience, and personality. Now, this was the last episode I'll publish before starting my PGCE. The next one will be after. Wish me luck. If you liked this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow the podcast on Twitter @mypgcepod or email mypgcepod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/mypgcepod and helping fund both the podcast and my PGCE course. Thank you, and talk again soon.